Hi, I'm Jim, the translator of this English version of Li Chao's story. I've been studying and working with Chinese for 30 years now. I came to it first as an undergraduate, a little later in life than standard, as a mature student, after a decade or so working in service and manual jobs after leaving school. I'm English and first learned Chinese at SOAS, part of the University of London, which taught the modern and classical language to absolute beginners such as myself. I was fortunate enough to embark on my undergraduate studies at a time when domestic UK students were exempt from fees and received a maintenance grant as well as access to loans. Our second year of study abroad in Beijing was also fully funded. If we're at the same stage of my life today, now such policies have been reversed, it's likely I'd still be back home pouring concrete and pulling pints instead. I had some broad awareness of various aspects of Chinese culture before choosing to study the language, through an interest in martial arts and associated religious and philosophical practices, an exposure to television adaptations of classic fiction, notably dubbed Japanese versions of The Water Margin and Journey to the West, and general reading and world history. But the decision to undertake the degree was to a large extent swayed by the idea that it would grant access to a major strand of the human story and a different version of how we understand ourselves. The sinosphere encompassed such a significant portion of humanity, and I was aware of how little I knew of it. It struck me that immersion in another of the world's major cultural and historical traditions could only enrich my understanding of what life means. That historical tradition includes particular paths to modernity and experiences of conflict and colonialism as the present nations of East Asia came into being, a history that is of course the central theme of Li Chao's monumental work. As a work of literature, Li's novel goes beyond the broad outline of events to provide a narrative of the lived experience of Taiwanese people at the grassroots, caught up in the tides of the times. Voices are imagined for members of a community at the literal margins, poor frontier farmers belonging to an ethnic minority. As a translator, it's enormously satisfying to be part of making this story of small lives against big history accessible where it has not been before. As with all lives, those of poor Hakka farmers carving a living out of virgin mountain and forest and facing threats from the state, landlords, non-Han indigenous neighbours and then an encroaching alien colonial power have specificities of time and place as well as universals common to us all. Literature's ability to present human dramas played out in contexts far different from our own has always been a big part of its power and appeal for me and, I trust, for readers of literature in translation. Taking into account the domestic significance of Li Chao's work and its impact, a further level of interest is to be found in considering the role it played in the construction of Taiwanese identity, and here again, translation affords us opportunities to understand more deeply parts of that debate. Given the setting of the novel and the history it recounts, there were a number of tricky translation problems, but relatively few set against the scope and scale of the work. Even where the standard Chinese is inflected by Hakka, most often in dialogue, the meaning is clear, especially having consulted the many resources now available online. My energies were more exercised in choosing an appropriate voice and tone for the English. There were several occasions when Japanese speech is reported in Chinese transliteration, which I must confess were beyond me given my lack of Japanese, but I was lucky to have excellent editors to come to my rescue. Similarly, names and terms in Taiwanese indigenous languages are beyond my expertise and required research and consultation. Often in a given passage, translating some complex human interaction proves straightforward, meaning that most time was spent on considering the English name for some native tree or flower mentioned almost in passing, or any of several dishes served at a family meal. Likewise, the details of certain traditional craft enterprises, such as camphor extraction, had no ready equivalents in English. Small errors in such matters would not really be fatal to the translation overall, but still not something as a translator you want to tolerate. Land tenure, both the traditional mix of practices under the Qing and the new impositions of the colonial regime, is of course of vital interest to the main protagonist and central to the whole story, but again not necessarily easy to relate for a contemporary English language reader, just as I suspect it was already a little abstruse for Li's first readership in Chinese. Knowing how onerous and precarious tendencies could be, of course, contributes greatly to our understanding of the predicament of the Peng family and why they might prefer the dangers of frontier land clearing to attempting to farm in more settled regions. The other side of the coin is concepts where an obvious and ready English translation exists, but at the expense of abandoning the full feel and connotations of the original. An example is chu ta, a term in Chinese for the headhunting practices of certain of the indigenous peoples, which I've mostly rendered as raiding. A more literal translation might be coming out of the grass or out of the scrub, a phrase that from our central protagonist's point of view adds to the sense of being beset by sudden dangers from all sides, but in most instances would be overdoing the English translation, given how commonplace the term was for the characters using it in the book. Beyond any difficulties, a translation such as this also offers enormous pleasures. For me, Li Qiao's characters really come alive. Through the course of working on this version of the novel, I came to feel a genuine sense of knowing them and their various personalities and motivations. The lyrical descriptions of the land, its forests and mountains were a delight too, serving to underline Li's strong feelings for both people and place. Over the course of a long translation career, you will work with all sorts of texts, not all of them particularly edifying or worthwhile, which only makes you appreciate all the more the opportunity to be part of bringing a work of such quality and value to an English language readership. I can only hope I have done this great novel some measure of justice.